In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for member statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Today's disappointing ABS wages data confirms that this Prime Minister continues to preside over record-low wages growth. Given that everything's going up except people's wages, why does the Prime Minister make it even harder for working Australians to make ends meet by supporting unilateral cuts to penalty rates? Why does the Prime Minister only ever look after the top end of town?
The Prime Minister has the call. Members on my right. Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And the wage price index increased by 0.6% in the June quarter. That's the fastest quarterly increase since March 2014. Mr Speaker, while the growth in average wages has been relatively low, we have turned the corner on wages growth, and the increase in the June quarter is an indication of that. I repeat, it's the fastest quarterly increase since March 2014. Mr Speaker, as the Reserve Bank Governor said only a week or so ago, the rate of wages growth appears to have troughed, and there are increased reports of skilled shortages in some areas. Mr Speaker, the relatively modest wage growth shows again why our personal income tax relief, $530 this year for middle-income families or taxpayers, is so important. It also underlines the importance of strong jobs growth. The reason we are starting to see a pickup in wages growth is because of more demand for labour. The laws of supply and demand have not been suspended. The Reserve Bank Governor notes that. We're seeing more demand for labour. We're seeing skill shortages starting to develop in some areas, hence wages are starting to move up. And what that means is that we need to maintain the momentum for strong economic growth. Now, all of that growth we've seen has been driven and enabled by our economic policies. We're bringing down energy prices. Companies are paying lower taxes. Individuals are paying less tax. Small and medium firms are investing and they are hiring, and that is why last year, calendar year, we saw the largest jobs growth in any calendar year in Australia's history. So we are delivering more jobs, stronger economic growth, and that is starting to be reflected, as the Reserve Bank Governor foreshadowed, in the wage growth figures, which, as I say, is the best, the largest or fastest quarterly increase since March 2014.
The member for Forde.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government's plan for lower taxes will benefit working Australians and small business, including in my electorate of Forde? And is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. We're ensuring that Australians, hard-working Australian families, can keep more of the money they earn. Despite the opposition from the Labor Party, we were able to reduce personal income tax for middle-income and lower middle-income Australians, $530 coming back from over 4 million taxpayers in this financial year. The Labor Party voted against our comprehensive personal income tax reform, just like they voted against our reductions in tax for small and medium companies, all of which are investing now and hiring, and that is why we're seeing that stronger wage growth. And of course, the other important element we're delivering is lower energy prices. We're turning the corner on energy prices. Now, Mr Speaker, there is a very straightforward question for the Leader of the Opposition to answer. Now, I recognise in his job he has some complex questions. He does. He has to work out how he's going to settle his pre-selection arrangements with the Victorian Premier. That would be pretty complicated.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order. Members on my right, Deputy Prime Minister. We're about to reduce the numbers in the House if members keep interjecting while I'm trying to hear a point of order. The Manager of Opposition Business.
On direct relevance, the question went to how the company tax policy of the government would trickle down to workers, and that's what he should be relevant to.
Well, I'll rule on the point of order when members are ready. It certainly did. It related to the topic of tax. The Prime Minister, indeed any minister, can compare and contrast, but I'm sure the Prime Minister's finished the comparison and coming back to the question.
Well, Mr Speaker, I return to the choices. I was asked about alternative approaches, and obviously there is one that the Leader of the Opposition is considering. He's got to ask himself, is he going to support lower taxes and lower energy prices? Now, we've already heard him. He says he wants to have not just higher taxes but higher energy prices. Lean, oh, nonsense, he says, the member for Isaac. The Labor Environmental Action Network, Lean, says higher prices are a sign the market is working. So they think it's terrific. That's the Labor Party. They want higher energy prices and higher taxes. Now, I know he's distracted by other important questions, some of them complex technological challenges. Is the microphone on? What does the green light mean? You know, is the handbrake on? We've seen all of those questions, but he can put them aside. The simple question for Labor is this: do you want Australians to pay lower taxes and lower energy prices? And if you want them to pay lower energy prices, the way forward is clear. Support the National Energy Guarantee.
The member for Longman.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Leader of the Opposition. Will the Leader of the Opposition inform the House about the progress through the Parliament of his private member's bill, which would restore penalty rates for working Australians? Is there any urgency to progressing this bill?
The Leader of the Opposition, just before I call the Leader of the Opposition, questions are allowed to private members on private members' bills that have been introduced by those members and on notices of motion. But I just remind the Leader of the Opposition, and indeed the House, for those who have queries about this, the Procedure Committee has ruled that if members on my right could cease interjecting, that would be handy. The Procedure Committee has ruled that the answers to those questions need to be confined to timing and procedure, and for those who are interested, it's outlined in the new practice on page 550. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
I thank the honourable member for her question. The private member's bill on the notice paper in my name deals with the restoration of Sunday and public holiday penalty rates, and it is urgent, as the House knows that the bill will not progress unless the government schedules debate and a vote during government business. In light of today's poor wages data, it is more urgent than ever that Australian workers get a pay rise.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the House, on a point of order.
You've already made it clear to the Leader of the Opposition that the answer,
members on my left,
the answer he can give needs to be limited to the progress of the legislation in terms of the number of hearings that might be scheduled into the legislation, the number of submissions that might have been received by the committee that might be investigating the bill. It cannot go to the substance of the bill, and it can't go to the subject matter of the bill in any respect. It can only go to the technical aspects of dealing with the bill.
The Leader, members on both sides will cease interjecting. If anyone interjects while I'm ruling on this point of order, they'll find they're watching the rest of the answer from the Leader of the Opposition from their office. I outlined the issue of timing and procedure at the start of the question. I'm not going to detain the House with all of the precedents, that is the answers that are being given, that go back to second airports and all the rest of it, but I can assure you I'm familiar with them. Everything the Leader of the House said about what could be in the Leader of the Opposition's answer is correct. but so far he's completely in order, and I'm listening very closely. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you. And it is most urgent that we debate the restoration of public holiday and Sunday penalty rates, because today's disappointing wages data highlights the need for this matter to be progressed during government business and scheduled for a vote. The data today reveals that private sector wages growth is below inflation. It is urgent. Everything in this country is going up but wages.
The Leader of the House on a point of order. The member for Barton is warned. She needs to realise she's in a seat where I hear her far more clearly. In the member for Jagger's old seat. The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is going to the question of why he wants his bill
Members
to be,
on both sides.
Why he wants his bill to be debated in the chamber, which is going to the subject matter of the bill and the subject itself. When he's not able to do that under the standing orders, as you pointed out, he's now talking about why he wants the bill to be on, as though it's a suspension of standing orders debate, where if he just mentions the procedure of the bill, he can then talk about the substance. He can't do that. It's a very, very, very narrow window of what he can actually talk about, and if the precedent is allowed for him to debate the subject—
Can you just pause? Leader of the House, just pause for a sec. Just pause for a sec. No, well, you might have finished, but I didn't hear the last bit, thanks to the member for Wakefield, who will now do as I predicted. He'll leave under 94A. I didn't hear the last 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I simply make the point is, if the Leader of the Opposition is allowed to actually debate the substance and the subject matter, it sets a new precedent, which you very clearly stated. It's a very limited opportunity to answer such a question if you're not a member of the front bench of the government, and I think that is a dangerous precedent for us to establish.
Leader of the House. I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business. Sean.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I followed your advice and had a look at page 50 of practice.
550.
550 of practice. Yep, I'm there right now, which goes quite specifically to whether or not there is urgency in a matter, and urgency is the only issue that the Leader of the Opposition has been dealing with and been given the reasons why it is urgent.
I obviously stand by my ruling on the Leader of the House's first point of order. The Leader of the Opposition shouldn't be debating the matter. He should be talking about urgency. And obviously in doing that, I say to the Leader of the House, he's entitled to talk about the subject of the bill. It's a little difficult to answer the question without saying what the bill's about. But on your second point of order that I'm ruling on now, the Leader of the Opposition, I think, is getting close now to debating the matter, which he shouldn't be doing. He needs to confine himself to urgency, timing, procedure. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
It is urgent to deal with our proposal to restore Sunday and public holiday penalty rates, because the workers of this country are going backwards under the Turnbull government and they need a wage rise.
The member for Capricornia.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how the government is cutting taxes and delivering certainty for working families and small businesses in central Queensland, including in my electorate of Capricornia? Are there any risks to the plan to reward hard-working Australians?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And if the Leader of the Opposition were so committed to businesses, so committed to workers, he would have backed the tax cuts that the Liberals and Nationals have put into place, would have backed the 27.5% tax rate, lowest it's been for 78 years. And that doesn't happen by chance.
The member for McEwen's warned.
That doesn't happen by coincidence. It happens because the Liberals and Nationals understand business, understand small business. And I tell you what, the member for Capricornia, she understands business. She understands because she walks up and down East Street and Rockhampton, the main street there, each and every non-sitting day, talking to business, listening to them, seeing what they say, telling her that they certainly want those tax cuts. They certainly don't want Labor rolling back those tax cuts. And what Labor members should do in their non-sitting days is go into their small businesses, in their electorates, and look those people in the eye and say, we should have supported those tax cuts. We should have supported you getting more money in your pocket. We should have supported you having the ability to hire more Australians, giving their young Australians their opportunity for their first job, giving an older Australian the opportunity for another career. And I tell you what, the member for Capricornia, she knows Simone Laurie from Artisan Gluten-Free Bakery. It's in East Street, Rockhampton. It's supportive of company tax cuts. It's also supportive of the Rookwood Weir, a $176.1 million contribution from the Commonwealth, not only to help flood mitigation for Rockhampton but also to drought-proof that particular area. Now, Artisan have won a suite of business awards across the region and the state. They make a mean apple turnover, I'm told, and certainly when it comes to turnovers, Labor doesn't understand the difference between turnover and profit. They think that if a business has a big turnover, that equals a big profit. Well, not necessarily so. And that's why we've got those tax cuts in. That's why we've got those tax cuts in, and we're working hard to make it easier for small businesses. Artisan, they employ 11 staff. It's a good little small business. Each and every one of the Labor members should go into their good little small businesses and apologise for the fact that they haven't backed the Liberal Nationals tax cuts, that the fact that they also stand for higher power prices. Higher taxes, higher power prices, that's the Labor way. That's the way of the member for Maribyrnong. But we're investing in critical infrastructure in the member for Capricornia's electorate. Rookwood Weir, as I said, $176.1 million. Bruce Highway, $10 billion. And I talked to a truckie the other day. The investment that we've made in the Gracemere sale yards to Rockhampton abattoirs is going to save trucks decoupling. It's going to save them 2 hours of time. That's the sort of infrastructure that we're investing in, and we back small businesses with lower power prices and lower taxes.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm reports he held crisis talks with government MPs last night in a bid to stop them voting against his energy policy? Given the Prime Minister has failed to appease his internal enemies by trading his convictions on climate change for new coal-fired power stations, what else is he planning to give up to the right wing of his party in order to keep his job?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank the honourable member for a question. Mr Speaker, it's the honourable member and her colleagues opposite that have given up on Australian families because it's the Labor Party that believes it's a good thing to have higher energy prices. It's the Labor Party that says higher prices mean the market is working. Well, it's certainly not working for Australian families. It is the Labor Party that is refusing and failing to support the National Energy Guarantee, which will bring down power prices. It is part of a suite of measures that we have already deployed, which is getting Australians a better deal on electricity. It's why we are seeing the retail prices, retail bills falling. Families are paying less for electricity already. We want to keep that trend, that momentum going, and the National Energy Guarantee is part of that. So the Labor Party, they've got lots of difficult questions to deal with, whether it's pre-selections or releasing lawyers' reports or complex technical matters or sort of canoeing up the Tarkine, doing a little bit of real estate spotting while he's doing that. All of those challenging problems, geographic, technological, psephological. Here's one straightforward question. Do you want Australians to pay less for electricity? Do you want Australians to have lower bills? We do. That's our commitment to the National Energy Guarantee. And when Labor, if it's fair dinkum about families, should back it. Should back it and stop worshipping with the lean network there at the proposition that higher electricity prices are somehow or other a good thing.
The member for Griffith is warned. The member for McEwen has already been warned. He won't interject again if he wishes to stay for the rest of question time. The member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The people of Mayo were made a series of funding promises during the recent by-election, including $10 million for the Mount Barker Aquatic Centre, $4.4 million for soccer pitches to the Mount Barker Sports Hub, $1 million for the strategic traffic plan in Hahndorf, $3.9 million for aged care beds in Strathalbyn, $750,000 for Kangaroo Island walking trails, and over $40,000 for community solar grants in Nairn, Macclesfield and Strathalbyn. Will the Prime Minister give his commitment that all of the government's by-election promises made to Mayo will be honoured during the term of this parliament? Thank you.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker. Thank you, Mr Speaker. And the only thing missing from the honourable member's list was the name of the candidate that secured those commitments, Georgina Downer. It was her. She secured those
members on both sides.
And I can assure the honourable member, that
members
those
on my left,
secured by her opponent, the Liberal candidate Georgina Downer, will be delivered. They will be delivered. But there'll be another election in Mayo, not before too long, and the honourable member will then have the opportunity to not simply thank the government for the delivery of the commitments that she's described, but she can also consider how she is going with the $700 million of promises she made in the course of the by-election. Mr Speaker, the reality is the government made the commitments, Georgina Downer secured them, and the government will deliver them.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on the steps the government is taking to strengthen competition, promote investment and reduce prices in energy markets? Is the Treasurer aware of any approaches that would seek to derail this success?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Boothby for her question, because she lived through, like all members from South Australia, through the failed Labor energy policy experiments of South Australia by the previous South Australian Labor government. They lived through the blackouts, they lived through the huge surges in prices, they lived through the failed Labor experiment. But I suspect the members opposite the Labor Party would probably think it was a success, because according to them, success is when prices go up. That's when you decide the policy is good, when the prices go up. Thank goodness for Premier Marshall, Mr Speaker, because he's setting things right in South Australia. He's getting on with the job of cleaning up the mess that Labor left behind in South Australia. And, Mr Speaker, Premier Marshall is supporting the National Energy Guarantee because he knows as a Premier who is fixing up the mess in South Australia on energy prices, that the National Energy Guarantee is an important part of setting things right. The National Energy Guarantee is a critical part of the government's plan to produce cheaper electricity prices. And this parliament has a critical opportunity to seize this moment, this sliding doors moment, for Australia to walk through and to be able to go onto a path of cheaper electricity prices, Mr Speaker. And there are two alternatives. One is we pass the National Energy Guarantee, and through that measure alone, a $150 reduction in household power bills, or go the Labor Party's path and see them go up by $190, Mr Speaker, because of their reckless target policies, which will only force electricity prices up. But the National Energy Guarantee is part of a bigger plan. The ACCC was commissioned by me as Treasurer, by the government, to go and put together further recommendations to lower electricity prices, for cheaper electricity. And the first thing they said was back the NEG. Back the National Energy Guarantee. That is a critical component. Secondly, they said to give customers more power by shining a light on what has been a lack of transparency of how big energy companies charge people in the market, and give consumers greater power to understand how they can get a better deal and ensure they get a better deal. To back in finance for new energy generation facilities across the country. That's their recommendation, to back that finance in, Mr Speaker, and that's what we're leaning into. And to put a leash on the big energy companies trying to gobble up smaller energy companies to ensure there is competition in the market. And that's a real plan. We're moving forward with all of those plans, Mr Speaker, to ensure that we can get cheaper electricity prices. But right now, the challenge is to pass the National Energy Guarantee. We do not want to let jobs and investment go offshore. BlueScope, Alcoa, BHP, Rio Tinto all saying pass the National Energy Guarantee because it will deliver lower electricity prices in Australia and support Australian jobs.
The member for Braddon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that Energy Security Board modelling assumes Tasmania's Battery of the Nation project won't go ahead under his National Energy Guarantee?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
In fact, Mr Speaker, under the National Energy Guarantee, Tasmania will be one of the biggest beneficiaries, Mr Speaker. One of the biggest beneficiaries. And do you know why, Mr Speaker? Do you know why? Because it has stable, dispatchable power in Tasmania, with so much of it being delivered by hydro facilities, Mr Speaker. And it's the Turnbull government that are interested in supporting a second interconnector between Tasmania and the mainland, which could provide additional energy security to the people in Tasmania while also supplying more power into Victoria, Mr Speaker. Now, what the National Energy Guarantee modelling shows is that Australian households will be $550 a year better off, $150 a year through the guarantee and around $400 from the other policies that are currently in practice. So under the National Energy Guarantee, Tasmania, like every other state across the country in the national electricity market, will be the beneficiary.
Members on my left, the member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Energy. Will the Minister update the House on how the National Energy Guarantee will result in lower power prices for Australian households and businesses, including in my home state of Victoria? Is the Minister aware of any other plans that will result in higher prices?
The Minister for Energy and the Environment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Chisholm for her question, and know that she supports the Turnbull government's moves to drive down power prices, knowing that under the coalition power prices will always be lower, and under the Labor Party they'll always go up, Mr Speaker. That is the track record of a Labor government. They were last in office when power prices doubled. They went up each and every year. And the member for Chisholm comes from that great state of Victoria. But unfortunately, with the Andrews Labor government, Victoria now has the second highest prices in the country. The second highest prices in the country. And last September, the Australian Energy Market Operator put out a report which said that there were up to a 43% chance of load shedding in Victoria. That's a euphemism for blackouts, Mr Speaker. And that is because the Andrews government cheered the closure of the Hazelwood Power Station, which could provide up to a quarter of Victoria's power supply. And if you look at the last 6 months in Victoria of 2017, Victoria was importing power instead of exporting it to the rest of the grid, Mr Speaker. Now, the member for Chisholm knows that since we've come to government, we have put downward pressure on prices by getting more gas into the market, by reining in the power of the network companies, which, if the Labor Party had thought about it when they were in office, would have saved consumers $6.5 billion, by getting a better deal from the retailers for millions of Australian customers, Mr Speaker, and of course through the National Energy Guarantee, which has been supported by groups in the members' electorate, like Asalio Care in Box Hill, which is a leading personal care and hygiene company with landmark brands such as Sorbent and Libra and Handy. It started in 1932. It was listed on the ASX in 2014. It has 11 manufacturing and distribution facilities and employs 1,000 people. And they have got behind the National Energy Guarantee, like the Victorian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, with 15,000 members, which said of the National Energy Guarantee, it was an important reform to improve energy policy predictability, to reduce risk, to encourage investment in new electricity generation, Mr Speaker. And we know that Manufacturers Australia have written in the Herald Sun about how important it is for the 1 million manufacturing workers across the country to have the National Energy Guarantee. So at the end of the day, if you believe in lower power prices, if you want to see Australian households $550 a year better off. If you want to see the wholesale price down by 20%, if you want to be side by side with the big employers across the country, you get behind the National Energy Guarantee and you don't hide from your responsibility, as the Leader of the Opposition is trying to do.
The member for Braddon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Again, my question is to the Prime Minister. Modelling conducted by Tas Hydro in support of the Battery of the Nation project states previous modelling showed that coal was not economic. This was carried forward as an assumption in the Battery of the Nation analysis. Can the Prime Minister confirm that his plan to build new taxpayer-funded coal-fired plants will undermine the Battery of the Nation project in Tasmania?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the honourable member for a question, and as the first person in enthusiastic approval of you doing more pumped hydro in Tasmania coined the phrase "Battery of the Nation," I'm very grateful for the question. I can confirm that the Battery of the Nation
members on my left
proposal, the origin of the Battery of the Nation proposal came from a speech I gave at the Press Club in February 2017, in which I—
members on my left. The Prime Minister has the call.
In which I spoke at the Press Club in February 2017 and identified the need for more storage to support the amount of intermittent renewables. I underlined the importance of having a technology-agnostic approach to energy in order to have cheaper electricity. The objective is to have cheaper electricity. The honourable member should not be so obsessed about one technology or another. Now, as it is, the recommendation 4 from the ACCC to provide support for new generation, competitive generation, is technology agnostic. It could apply to energy from a pumped hydro scheme in Tasmania or in any other part of the country, just as it could apply to a new thermal plant, be it coal or gas or a mixture of all of the above. It is technology agnostic, and it has one objective and one objective alone, which is to deliver cheaper electricity. As Rod Sims said himself, if we start picking one technology after another, that leads to higher electricity prices. You've got to have a system, a plan that delivers energy at a cheaper price, and that needs to be technology agnostic. And the honourable member she's endeavouring to interject, and I thank her for her contribution, which I can barely hear because her mic isn't on. The Leader of the Opposition has a problem with that too, of course. But the fact is that all technologies have a role to play, and the approach we are taking is technology agnostic because we want to deliver cheaper electricity. Pumped hydro and wind in Tasmania no doubt has a big role to play, but let the market decide, let it compete, and then we will see the real winners will be not one theory or another, not one technology or another, but Australian families, cheaper electricity. That's what the honourable member should be supporting. We look forward to her and her party supporting the National Energy Guarantee, cheaper electricity. That's what it's all about.
Just before I call the member for Moore, I'd like to inform the House we have just had join us in the gallery this afternoon a parliamentary delegation from the National Assembly of the Republic of Korea. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you. The member for Moore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services. Will the Minister update the House on how the government is ensuring the future prosperity of all Australians, including those in my electorate of Moore? Is the Minister aware of any threats posed by alternative approaches?
The Minister for Financial Services and Revenue.
I thank the member for his question and for hosting me in his electorate only a few weeks ago, and I'd like to publicly congratulate him for the very fine work that he is doing, because he is delivering, and delivering more for his constituents of Moore. He is delivering more tax relief for small, medium and family-sized enterprises, around 15,000 in his electorate of Moore, and he is delivering more tax relief for those hard-working Australians, around 65,000 of them who work hard every day and who will benefit from our personal income tax relief that has been legislated through both houses of this parliament, because he understands that people work hard for their money and they deserve to keep more of it after we secure the essentials that government needs to deliver. And of course, part of the government's personal income tax plan is to ensure that 9 out of 10 Australians will pay a marginal tax rate of no more than 32.5 cents in the dollar. Now, the member asks me about alternative approaches. Well, he would probably be aware that the Leader of the Opposition does see things rather differently. He would like to saddle his fellow Australians with more than $200 billion of new taxes. He would like to slug the Australian economy with over $200 billion of new taxes. And why is this? Because the Leader of the Opposition, he is not only short on authenticity, as he made very clear through the hot mic incident in Queensland, but he's also short on ideas. He is short on ideas about how to build the economy, how to manage the Australian economy, how to grow the Australian economy. To him, economic policy simply means all of the multiple ways he can reach in and pick your pocket. Let's just take the mega retirees tax as just one example, because this is not just picking the pocket. This is a smash and grab on retirees right across the country, a $55 billion smash and grab on them, and it will punish around 1 million Australians if he has his way. It will see the reduction for these Australians, the potential reduction for them in their income, around 30% of their income if they do not get their tax refunds. He does not want to encourage aspirational self-reliance. In fact, he wants to see more people on welfare, not less, because he claims it's all about fairness, but these people are some of the lowest, most vulnerable people in this country. They are low-income earners. They cannot afford his tax slug, and he shouldn't be allowed to get away with it.
The minister's time has concluded. The member for Eden-Monaro.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In Senate estimates, Snowy Hydro was asked if the construction of new coal-fired power stations would put the viability of Snowy 2.0 in doubt. Snowy Hydro's Chief Operating Officer responded, and I quote, simply put, yes. Prime Minister, why are you jeopardising Snowy 2.0?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank the honourable member. Honourable member, the government's getting on with Snowy Hydro 2.0, and it's going to be built. There'll be lots of jobs created in the honourable member's electorate. And the reality is that Snowy Hydro 2.0 will put downward pressure on electricity prices because it will reduce volatility in the electricity market. It has an enormous role to play in delivering greater security and lower prices. It's all. I heard the honourable member agree with me when I said it would deliver lower prices. What a pity it wasn't his idea or the Labor Party's idea. What a pity! What a pity! What a pity! What a pity that it fell to the Liberal Party and the National Party to come back and get that great project out of the old cobweb filing cabinet that had been left in the late 1980s, to get that back and get on with it. The Labor Party talks about energy and they talk about renewables, but there's all ideology and plenty of idiocy. We're providing the engineering and the economics. And the engineering and the economics mean you've got to have cheaper electricity. And to have cheaper electricity, you need to have storage, and that's the role pumped hydro can play. And I thank the honourable member, although he's not necessarily very factual in his responses, but I thank him for giving me the opportunity to talk about one of the great price-reducing initiatives, engineering initiatives, economic initiatives of my government.
The member for Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Could the minister please update the House on the importance of reliable and affordable energy for Australia's manufacturing exports? Is the minister aware of any threats to successful manufacturing export?
Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for a question. I know she's a very strong supporter, the member for Gilmore, for reliable and affordable energy, as her electorate is, of course, home to workers from Port Kembla BlueScope. The steelworks there are a great example of Aussie enterprise in action. And I'm very pleased, Mr Speaker, that the Coalition, through the Prime Minister, was able to secure the only country exemption from the United States steel tariffs, delivered by this Prime Minister in direct discussions with the US President, that have safeguarded the jobs of those workers in the member's electorate. So it's an absolute credit to her strong advocacy as well. And in fact, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition might be interested to know that BlueScope have a product that he might be interested in. They produce, of course, Colorbond, and he could use a Colorbond fence. I mean, they might even name it after him. They could call it Colour Bill. And on one side it could be red, and the other side it could be green.
The minister will pause for a second. No, look.
Good. I like that.
I've warned about the use of correct titles. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I've sat the minister down before. Okay.
I was talking about a Colorbond product, Mr Speaker. But I'll carry on.
You don't have the call, actually, and you're about to not get it. It's very clear what the minister was trying to do, and that was refer to the Leader of the Opposition by an incorrect title. Okay. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So as Australia's largest domestic manufacturer, with an energy bill of around $150 million a year, certainly BlueScope recognises the importance of energy certainty and energy cost and reliability. And in fact, the malign legacy of the Australian Labor Party is a threat that must be addressed. In fact, when Labor was last in office, we saw energy costs double, increasing by 101%. So the fact is that there is a real threat to the future of jobs at manufacturers like BlueScope, and that threat is the Australian Labor Party and the Leader of the Opposition as he goes about his mission impossible, Mr Speaker, of trying to appease both the Greens and the CFMEU at the same time when it comes to energy policy. I mean, you can almost imagine it, Mr Speaker, a top-secret meeting between the Labor and the Greens. They say your mission, should you choose to accept it, make Australia's coal workers think that you're standing up for them on the red side, just like the clean event workers did, and also make those in the inner-city suburbs think that you're standing up for the environment on the green side. The simple fact is that this Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, is no Tom Cruise. The simple fact is this Leader of the Opposition is the kind of guy who's going to let down the workers of BlueScope. He's going to let down those who are concerned about the environment, because the simple, inescapable fact of Labor's policy, Mr Speaker, is that Labor's federal energy policy will be a continuation of an approach that has seen higher energy prices, that saw a doubling of energy costs when Labor was last in power, and that will see blackouts not only in South Australia but across the country as a direct result.
Members on both sides. The member for Barton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to reports today that the government's robo-debt program is now targeting the homeless and people with mental illness, impairments and chronic illness. Given the government's own figures show that the robo-debt program has got it wrong on almost 20,000 occasions, why is the government continuing to target the most vulnerable people in Australia?
The Minister for Human Services.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for that question. And it gives me a chance to correct the record, I think, from some of the inaccuracies that were contained within that report. But I want to start by saying there is a fundamental principle within our welfare system, and that is when somebody has been overpaid money, either inadvertently because they've told us the wrong information or deliberately where they've given us incorrect information, they are required to repay that money. and that is a fundamental principle of our welfare system that has been upheld by governments of this political persuasion and by governments of that political persuasion. Indeed, let me go. I've got a media release here from 2011.
Member for Isaacs will cease interjecting.
Issued by the now Leader of the Opposition and the now Deputy Leader of the Opposition, who were then the Assistant Treasurer and the Minister for Human Services. And the release has headed welfare debt recovery process to be automated. This is, the release goes on to brag about the compliance efforts that were undertaken by the then Gillard government in 2011. And indeed, the now Deputy Leader of the Opposition goes on to say, if people fail to come to an arrangement to settle their debts, the government has a responsibility to taxpayers to recover the money. The government has a responsibility to taxpayers to recover the money. Now, not only is it an important principle within the welfare system, it's actually also the law.
The
Social Security Act of 1991 demands that the government recover debts where people have been paid money from the social security system that they are not entitled to, and we will continue to uphold that principle. Now, Mr Speaker, the question is how we go about that, and clearly there are groups of people who have debts to the Commonwealth who do find themselves in special circumstances, and when that is the case, we take into account the special circumstances in which they find themselves in. Where somebody who has been identified as vulnerable has a debt, we work with them to update their income details, and we understand the need to deal with these people sensitively. Debts are not raised unless a person has been contacted and discussed their individual circumstances with their department, and in cases where a debt is raised, my department will work closely with people on an appropriate repayment plan and to organise options for that person to repay the money. And there are 700 social workers within the Department of Human Services that can help us do that. Now, Mr Speaker, considering of course the vulnerabilities of some people that do owe us debts, I've asked that the trial that we had conducted here is put on pause whilst we make sure that when we go to recover these debts we are doing it in the most sensitive way possible, and that trial will not proceed until I am satisfied that that is the case.
The member for Fadden.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on steps the government has taken to protect Australians from dangerous visa holders, including outlaw motorcycle gang members? Is the minister aware of any different views that would weaken border security?
The Minister for Immigration and Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Well, all Australians know that this government has worked day and night to keep our borders secure, to make sure that we don't allow the people smugglers back in control. But one of the other significant outcomes for this government, Mr Speaker, is that we've been able to cancel a record number of visas, so non-citizens, people who are here in our country, perhaps on tourist visas, working temporarily in our country, maybe as people studying in tertiary institutions here, and they've committed serious crimes against Australians. So some people, for example, have committed sexual offences against children or against women in our country, and we've cancelled more visas of those criminals in the last 12 months than Labor did in 6 years. And Mr Speaker, I'm proud of the fact that we've been able to not only cancel those visas, but on the advice of the Australian Institute of Criminology and research that they've just released, we have, on their estimates, stopped 2,975 additional offences being committed by those people had they been allowed to stay in Australia. So about 3,000 offences would have been committed by these criminals, and on the AIC advice, that would have been about 1,000 people. So we're talking about 1,000 Australians who would have fallen victim to these criminals had these criminals been allowed to stay in Australia. Now, one of our principal targets, Mr Speaker, has been the outlaw motorcycle gang members, 190 of whom we've now cancelled, and they've been deported or they're awaiting deportation from our country. Now, they are people that weren't deported. In fact, the Labor Party issued visas to many of these criminals to be in our country, and we've cancelled the visas. Now, Mr Speaker, it's interesting to note that the outlaw motorcycle gang members are the biggest distributors of ice in our country. If you're in a country town or you're in an outer suburban area or you're in a capital city, know that if your kids are at risk of receiving drugs from the local drug dealer, likely those drugs will have been imported or distributed by outlaw motorcycle gangs. That's not their only pursuit, Mr Speaker, because we know that the outlaw motorcycle gangs are also affiliated with our old friends at the CFMEU. The CFMEU. Now, why wouldn't Labor want to cancel the visas of outlaw motorcycle gangs, the members of whom are affiliated with the CFMEU? About 11 million reasons, Mr Speaker. $11 million the CFMEU has donated to the Labor Party. Who is the biggest supporter in this parliament of the CFMEU? Who is it? It's our old friend, the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker. His links back to the CFMEU are as— Mr Speaker, his links back to the CFMEU, you would not believe he has, on behalf of the Labor Party, accepted millions and millions of dollars. And don't believe a word he says. It would continue if he was in—
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In question time on Monday, the Environment Minister claimed that his department undertook a first phase of due diligence which failed to contact the Great Barrier Reef Foundation but looked at its fundraising history. In his brief for the April 9 meeting, where he offered it almost $500 million in taxpayers' money, what amount was the Prime Minister advised the foundation had raised from corporate or private sources over its entire history? What was the figure that due diligence told him they had raised?
Prime Minister has the call.
I'll ask the Minister for the Environment to answer the question, but I just want to remind the honourable member that when he was Minister for the Environment in 2012, he made a substantial grant to that foundation, which resulted in the department working closely with the foundation for all of the period since then. So the department was and remains very familiar with the work of the foundation, has had extensive experience which may well have predated the minister's intervention in 2012, but was certainly enabled and accelerated by the minister's decision to make a $12 million grant to the foundation.
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Well, Mr Speaker, it's very well known that the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Foundation has been the largest charity with the reef, Mr Speaker. The largest
Member
charity.
For McMahon.
And how do we know that? Because in 2012, when the member for Watson gave millions of dollars to the foundation, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority announced then that it was the most successful charity, Mr Speaker. Now, we know that the head of the charity, Anna Marsden, has told the 7:30 report that it has been able to raise over $90 million from a range of sources, about $25 million of which is from government sources, both federal and state, and tens of millions of dollars are from the private sector and from philanthropic needs. But, Mr Speaker, the question is, why didn't we get any questions yesterday from the member for Watson? Well, maybe because there was a headline in the Australian. The member for Watson denies the double standard.
The Minister will resume his seat. Minister will resume his seat, and the Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. I've got to say to the Minister candidly, the question isn't why there wasn't a question yesterday. That's not the question at all. And the subject matter he's now introducing does not relate at all to the Great Barrier Reef. Couldn't be further away. The Minister needs to be relevant to the question.
Mr Speaker, the reality is that the foundation is the largest reef charity. The reality is there's going to more than $200 million is going to improving farming practices, preventing sediment, nitrogen and pesticide runoff. The reality is that $100 million is going to the best available science, Mr Speaker. The reality is that money is going to tackling the crown of thorns starfish, Mr Speaker. This will create jobs in the member for Herbert's electorate, Mr Speaker. This will create jobs in the member for Flynn's electorate, Mr Speaker. This will create jobs in the member for Leichhardt's electorate. That is why the head of the tourism bodies up in the reef area welcomed our announcement and said it underpinned regional jobs. Now, I remind the House that my department told me in writing that this contribution to the Reef Foundation would ensure that we would meet our objectives in protecting the reef, that it represented value for money, Mr Speaker, and that it was consistent and compliant with our Accountability Act, Mr Speaker. So the Labor Party is only raising this issue because when they were in government they abandoned the reef.
The member for Bennelong.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Law Enforcement and Cyber Security. Will the minister update the House on what actions the government is taking to stop illicit drugs from making their way onto our streets, and would different approaches achieve the same success?
The Minister for Law Enforcement.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question, and I commend him for his interest in keeping drugs off the streets of Bennelong, his electorate. And of course we're all interested on this side of the House in keeping drugs off the street, and so I'm pleased to update the House on our operational successes, the operational successes of our law enforcement agencies since the 1st of July. This is just the last 6 weeks, and in that time our agencies have shut down a European drug syndicate importing MDMA and cocaine in large quantities, allegedly, into Australia. They've shut down a clandestine drug lab in Sydney with 150 litres of methamphetamine seized. They've charged 2 men attempting to import almost 100 kilograms of cocaine, and they've seized over half a tonne, 600 kilograms of cocaine being imported into Queensland. Now, Mr Speaker, that is on top of 10.7 tonnes of hard drugs intercepted at our borders in the last financial year. 10.7 tonnes that would have ended up on our streets, devastating our local communities, having a horrific impact in our suburbs, in our cities, in our regional towns and rural centres. Mr Speaker, we know that our communities know a great deal about what's going on the streets. And for that reason, we recently announced a reinvestment in the Dob in a Dealer campaign run by Crime Stoppers. It's funded by proceeds of crime, dollars destined to line the pockets of serious criminals. And I call on anyone with information that can help with investigations or prosecution of criminals smuggling, peddling drugs, to call Crime Stoppers on 1800 333 000, 1800 333 000. That's just one step we're taking to disrupt the work, the business models of drug dealers in this country. But on top of that, Mr Speaker, we've established Australia's first transnational serious organised crime coordinator. We've boosted funding into domestic policing by $320 million and provided $100 million to the anti-gang squad, or over $120 million. In contrast, Mr Speaker, the former Labor government raided the budgets of our law enforcement agencies to bolster their faltering budget. In their last 4 years in government, those opposite cut $128 million from the AFP, 700 staff and $735 million from customs, and they cut air cargo screening by 75%. Mr Speaker, this government is absolutely committed to keeping illicit drugs off the streets of our suburbs, our cities, our towns, and giving our law enforcement agencies the support they need to get the job done.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Environment Minister. How can the minister claim there was extensive due diligence before offering the foundation almost $500 million when the government didn't contact the foundation, didn't go through all of its annual reports, didn't know how much money the foundation had raised, and as has been revealed today—
The Manager of Opposition Business will just pause for a second. Members on my right will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business, I'd like to ask him to repeat his question again. Members on my right expect me to hear the questions, particularly when the Leader of the House raises points of order on them. The Manager of Opposition Business, if you could just start again.
Thanks, Speaker. The question is to the Environment Minister. How can the government claim there was extensive due diligence before offering the foundation almost $500 million when the government didn't contact the foundation, didn't go through all its annual reports, didn't know how much money the foundation had raised, and, as has been revealed today, is a foundation that has now had to contract out its fundraising plan to a consultant, which was the very issue that the government had claimed was its core expertise?
Hear, hear. The Minister for the Environment.
Well, that fundraising expertise must have been the reason why the Labor Party welcomed the announcement of $500 million when we did. Thanks to the member for Sydney. That fundraising expertise must be the reason why the member for Watson gave $12.5 million when he was last in government. That must be the reason why the member for Grayndler has called the foundation a reputable organisation, Mr Speaker. Always rely on the member for Grayndler for a timely intervention. Now, Mr Speaker, as I've told the House previously, there was due diligence conducted by my department. In the first phase of due diligence, they looked at its governance, its structure, its constitution, its project management, its fundraising history, its capacity for growth, its board composition and its science expertise, Mr Speaker. On the second phase of due diligence, which then informed their final recommendation to me, Mr Speaker, which I signed off on the 20th of June under Section 71 of the Public Governance, Performance and Accountability. They made it very clear that they looked at the corporate information, the financial reports, compliance with applicable laws, litigation, property searches, asset checks of the foundation directors and engaging the Australian government solicitor. Now, Mr Speaker, we've got to go back to the reason why the Labor Party is raising this issue at this time. And it's because when they were in office, they put the reef on the path to the endangered list, Mr Speaker. On the path to the endangered list. And, Mr Speaker, I want to read from a 2012 statement from the World Heritage Committee. In the absence of substantial progress, the possible inscription of the property on the list of the World Heritage in danger, Mr Speaker. Now, we know that the Labor Party had 5 capital dredge disposal projects planned for the Marine Park, and we know, thanks to the good work of my predecessor, he actually banned those dredge disposal projects and the ones going forward. We know that through the good work of my predecessor, we put in place a $2 billion Reef 2050 plan with the Queensland Government, Mr Speaker. And we know that this $500 million has been welcomed, Mr Speaker, including by the Queensland Premier, Mr Speaker, and the Queensland Minister of the Environment, who in a joint statement with me said on the 20th of July about the $500 million, the actions of the work we're doing with the $2 billion Reef 2050 long-term sustainability plan will be bolstered by the recent investment of an additional $500 million in the Great Barrier Reef by the Australian Government, Mr Speaker. So there we have it. A Labor Queensland Premier saying that this $500 million will bolster our efforts. We have the member for Grayndler saying it's a reputable organisation. We have the member for Sydney welcoming the announcement was made, and we have the member for Watson giving money to the same foundation when they were in office. Talk about hypocrisy. Thy name is the Labor Party.
Minister's time has concluded. The member for McKellar.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister outline to the House how a strong economy enables the government to subsidise life-changing medicines for thousands of Australians living with cancer? Is the minister aware of any different attitudes to subsidising medicines?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for McKellar for his question, but also his strong advocacy for new medicines and for new medicines being listed on the PBS, but his recognition that this can only be done where there is a strong economy. One of the reasons he knows this is because the 2011 budget papers made it absolutely clear that without a strong economy, medicines could not be listed. And I will remind the House of that 2011 budget paper which said, quote, "Given the current fiscal environment, the listing of some medicines would be deferred until fiscal circumstances permit." And those medicines were severe asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, deep vein thrombosis, endometriosis, IVF and schizophrenia, amongst other things. Fortunately, fiscal circumstances now permit the listing of every medicine that the medical experts recommend. That is the policy and that is the practice of this government. And the fiscal circumstances have seen 1 million extra jobs created, a transformation of the nation's finances and the ability to ensure that every medicine that the experts recommend will be listed. In that context, I was privileged and pleased to announce recently that four new cancer medicines would be listed on the PBS. This includes medicines for lymphoma, medicines for leukemia and medicines in particular to ensure that those dealing with the challenge of chemotherapy would be able to manage it. One important medicine, however, was the listing of Opdivo for head and neck cancer. And I want to give a quote from one of the beneficiaries of that program who had been on a trial, Mr David Littlewood from Queensland, who commented in The Australian on the 27th of July in relation to the listing of a medicine for head and neck cancer. This immunotherapy was my last chance to tackle terminal cancer. It is a life-saving therapy. I would just be another number if it wasn't for it. And that is the medicine Opdivo. 1,000 patients will benefit from that listing. It would have otherwise cost $50,000 a year for each patient, and it's something that could not be possible if there weren't the fiscal circumstances that would permit. It's something that would not be possible if the nation's economy was not healthy. So it's why we do our work, both in terms of the economy, why we do our work as members of the parliament, and why this government focuses so much on the fact that if you can get the fiscal circumstances right, you can deliver these new medicines to Australians. That's the right thing to do in government, and it's the right outcome.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, the Prime Minister could not name who had the idea to offer almost $500 million of taxpayers' money to a small private foundation. But today, the Prime Minister has already used question time to claim other ideas as his own work. Can the Prime Minister now tell us who came up with a $500 million taxpayer-funded giveaway idea? Or, to put another way, if it was such a good idea, why won't the Prime Minister tell us whose idea it was?
The Prime Minister has to call.
Well, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition clearly hasn't been listening to the Minister for the Environment, who said a number of times, as have others, that the submission to make the contribution to the Great Barrier Reef Foundation was made by the Minister for the Environment and went through the full pre-budget cabinet process with which the honourable member is no doubt familiar with from his time in government. But, Mr Speaker, when it comes to ideas, the very sad thing that we have to confront today is the Leader of the Opposition and the Labor Party have no ideas for cheaper electricity. They have no ideas for anything else except higher taxes, higher prices for energy, fewer jobs, less investment and lower wages. That is the melancholy list of the Labor Party's lack of ideas, and when it comes to higher energy prices, they celebrate it and describe it as a triumph of the market working well.
The member for Corangamite.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. Will the minister update the House on how the government is delivering the essential services Australians with a disability rely upon through the National Disability Insurance Scheme?
The Minister for Social Services.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for her question and for her support of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It wasn't long ago that we were visiting the new site for the NDIA, and it was a very important visit. And can I say that she is right, that the NDIS is an essential service that is being provided to Australians with a disability. More than that, it is life-changing. It is the biggest social reform than any of us will see in our lifetime. In her electorate of Corangamite, over 2,800 people now have access to the scheme. Half of these people have never had any access to any support in their lives. These Australians are just some of the 180,000 people who have now begun accessing the NDIS, over 55,000 who are getting support for the first time in their lives. These are not just numbers. They are all individual lives that are being changed by the NDIS. It is allowing Australians with a disability to live life, to the full. Before the NDIS, Shelley Lind was uncertain about her future and her son's. At 6 months, her son Alex had already had numerous surgeries and a diagnosis of neurofibromatosis and autism. This combination means Alex needs one-on-one attention, weekly speech therapy, occupational therapy and physiotherapy. Through the NDIS, Shelley and Alex are now receiving funding to cover his needs. As Shelley has said, before the NDIS I found it frustrating. If I can't pay for it, how am I supposed to do it? The NDIS has alleviated the financial pressures. To go from nothing to Alex having all of his therapy costs paid for, it means so much to our family. Without all this, we would not have been able to start school. As Shelley Lind knows, the NDIS is giving people with a disability like Alex a chance they never thought possible. We would not be able to do this without fully funding the NDIS. It is why this government is committed to fully funding the NDIS and to provide the essential services Australians with a disability rely on. At full scheme, there will be over 460,000 people that rely on the NDIS, and nearly 90,000 jobs will be created to provide support. We are working hard to complete this life-changing social reform to ensure all—
The Minister's time has concluded. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Prime Minister.